Hey everyone, how are you? I'm Adam Shopcorn from Fort Gansevoort Gallery. That's Maggie Doherty. That's Katie Larson and Ethan Chevalier's downstairs. Thanks to my small but mighty team that work with me every day to get done what we get done. Thank you to Leslie King Hammond, Lowery Stokes Sims. It's a pleasure to have you guys here with us. I told them it's precious cargo in the house tonight, so we have to take good care of them. Thanks to Willie Birch for making the work that he makes. We really, it's very exhilarating working with him, and he's become a good friend to us over the years, and we've learned that he's usually right. In the end, even without wavering. Sometimes we go to sleep at night wondering if he's right or not, and then we wake up in the morning, and he's right. So thank you guys. I don't know your relationship or your history with Mr. Birch too much, but I'm excited to hear you all speak about him. And we really do appreciate you coming up from Baltimore. If you were in town or not in town, I'm not sure the intricacies of where you guys were, but you're here now, which is what's most important to us. So I'm going to turn it over to Maggie, and then I'm going to let you guys get rolling. And thanks to you guys for taking time out of your days to come take a look at the show and listen to these nice ladies talk about Mr. Birch. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam. Hello, everyone. I'm Maggie Doherty. I'm the director here at Fort Gansevoort. Up on the roof is our third solo exhibition with Willie Birch, featuring a compelling new body of work created over the past 2 to 3 years. This exhibition marks an important milestone in Mr. Birch's career, arriving just ahead of his major touring museum retrospective, Willie Birch Stories to Tell. Organized by the American Federation of Arts and the New Orleans Museum of Art, the retrospective will open its first chapter in May at the California African American Museum in Los Angeles. Leslie and Lowery have long been dedicated champions of Mr. Birch's art, both as friends and as scholars.
And enemies.
And enemies.
Okay.
Which we will certainly illuminate.
Through their curatorial work and writing, they'll illuminate the social, cultural, and historical resonance of his practice. Both women are also contributing authors to the artist's forthcoming retrospective catalog to be published by Yale University Press and the American Federation of Arts. It's an incredible privilege to have them with us today. I'd like to begin quickly by introducing Leslie. Leslie is an art historian, curator, community innovator, cultural activist, and artist. She is Professor Emeritus, former graduate dean, and founding director of the Center for Race and Culture at the Maryland Institute College of Art, which is also Mr. Birch's alma mater. Mm-hmm. Leslie serves on the board of the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture, the Peabody Essex Museum, the American Craft Council, and the advisory board of Handwork 2026. Over the course of her distinguished career, she has curated numerous exhibitions and authored influential essays on artists and movements, including Jacob Lawrence, Betty Saar, Amina Brenner Lynn Robinson, Joyce Scott, and so many more. She is the recipient of numerous honors, including the Alan Locke International Prize and the Lifetime Achievement Award for the Women's Caucus for Art. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Lowery. Lowery is a specialist in modern contemporary art, craft, and design. She serves on the education and curatorial staff of the Metropolitan Museum of Art from 1972 to 1999, was executive director and president of the Studio Museum in Harlem from 2000 to 2007, and later curator emeritus at the Museum of Art and Design from 2007 to 2015. More recently, she has worked as an independent curator and consultant for institutions including the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, Craft Contemporary in Los Angeles, and the Baltimore Museum of Art. Sims was visiting professor at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University from 2018 to 2020, and serves as the 2021 to 2022 Kress Beneke Professor at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Among her many accolades, she's received the Lifetime Achievement Award for Curatorial Excellence from the College Art Association and the Award of Distinction from the American Craft Council. I'm going to turn it over to these two. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to have you here.
Thank you. There we go.
And feel free to just pin it.
So I'm going first. I have notes because I'm old. And there's some points I want to make sure I don't miss. And as Maggie mentioned, we are the proud contributors to the AFA catalog. And Audrey Whalen, who is our guide, is here. And thank you, Audrey, for everything you did. So when the AFA approached us about doing a piece on Willie, I was looking at the checklist and I said, oh, why don't I do his paper mache works? Because certainly the gallery had done a show a couple of years ago that featured the work. But when you Google his paper mache works, it goes on. He did a lot. And what I found myself engaged in was not only Willie doing paper mache, but why was he doing paper mache? Why was he doing it in the 1990s? Why was he doing it in New York City at a time? This was like the dumbest time to be doing paper mache in terms of the art world, the expectations for Black artists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what is amazing with his use of paper mache is he takes it to heights and scales and proportions I've never seen before, you know. And I mean, think about this, is 55 inches tall, 4 feet. These are 4+ feet tall. This one has this huge blanket chronicling the life of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. So it's you know, like, it's like paper mache. So I'm going to try to sort of capture everything that I know about this. I should also say that most of this work I've never seen in person. So this is a kind of virtual experience. And probably when I see the show, I'll probably see them at first and I'll sit there and go, why did I write that? It's a crock of crap. I should have written this. But I mean, that's what the risk you kind of take. All right, come on, darling. So I'm doing paper mache, and then I'm sitting there going, well, to do paper mache, I have to like start at the beginning, because there were a lot of things I didn't know about Willie. And so learning about his early education in New Orleans, where he studied sculptural works, mostly carving in wood, as you can see by the piece on the left, and sort of really learning how to use materials in a very interesting kind of way. He's attributed his teachers and his influencers to having him understand the possibilities of found wood and finding, you know, shapes that sort of really came out of it. A kind of piece that he did later when he got to graduate school with Leslie, who slapped him around a bit, is this crucifix, which he did for St. Xavier Church in Baltimore, which is the oldest Black parish Catholic Black parish in the United States. But, you know, as many artists are, there are stops along the way. So while he was at MICA, he did some experimentation with what we might call color field painting, pattern and decoration, and sort of minimalism. And one of the pieces that really struck me was this Land of the Black series, which, you know, they were sort of vague kind of geographic references, and immediately had me wondering, did he know the work of Frank Bowling, who was doing sort of minimalist painting with these kind of stencil shapes of the continents, particularly Africa and South America. And then Jazz Number 4 sort of really, you know, presents this kind of, you know, personal symbology, but certainly, you know, sort of represents the kind of more decorative aspects that were happening in New York. So I think the interesting thing about, because Willie talks a lot about in different interviews about his time in New York. He actually spent about 25 years outside of New Orleans. Is that right? Yeah, 69 to 94. Mm-hmm. So we think of him as the quintessential New Orleans artist, but he spent a lot of time out of New Orleans. Mm-hmm. And so there's a great interview that he did with Leslie that's posted on the gallery's website, where he sort of talks about how he sort of really got interested in paper. And when we talked, he sort of mentioned that, you know, around the 80s, he went to Egypt and got really involved in papyrus. And he was really struck by the fact that it's, as he said, paper has been treated as a fragile substance, so it has no real value. And it's the preciousness that comes. It's not the paper, it's the idea of what this represents. And this was like an interesting idea, because I think if Willie was just doing this paper mache work in New Orleans, it would have just been seen as a local, regional manifestation. Mm-hmm. Because mm-hmm. we're very, you know, like most of the floats in New Orleans, I tried to find some process photographs, but it was hard to sort of download them. You know, they're made out of paper mache, so mm-hmm. he was very familiar with the mm-hmm. technique. He talks about the catalytic moment for him was visiting New Orleans while he was in New York with his friend Martina Gutierrez, who was involved in paper mache at the time, and seeing this crucifix, which you can see up there, at St. Louis Cathedral. And doing the history of St. Louis Cathedral is one of those things that was, you know, built in, you know, 2500 BC, and then it burnt down several times. And so a lot of times they couldn't replace, I meant the 2500 BC as a joke. Anyway, so this is really a paper mache crucifix that's covered over with plaster, which was a familiar technique. So I was really interested in this whole kind of thing. I'm going to skip this one and come back to it, because Willie started talking about some of the artists that he was really close to. And one of them was Leslie Dill, and another was David Hammond. So that also got me thinking about Tommy Lanigan Schmidt and what was going on in the 80s and 90s as we're moving past color field painting and minimalism and the sort of strictures of Clement Greenberg's eschatological, you know, view of art, bringing back neo-primitivism, neo-Baroque, but also questioning the valuative aspects of materials. So there were a lot of people. So Tommy Lanigan Schmidt made a whole career making religious objects and other kinds of objects that we would experience in museum as very precious materials out of foil and pipe cleaners and glitter, and in that mm-hmm. sense. David Hammond's, of course, this is an example of one of his barbecue bags and sort of black hair. So he, you know, greasy bags and barbecue bones. Mm-hmm. And so he's using this in these materials in a way, picking up stuff from, you know, barbecue joints and barbershops to sort of create these kind of highly conceptual work. And then Leslie Dill was doing all these works where the dress became a sort of forum for text, particularly about forgotten women in art history. So these are the kinds of things that really contextualize Willie's work for me. He mentions very specifically, I want to go back now, sorry, that while he and David, you know, like were close at a point, they had a kind of parting of the ways because David was so conceptual. So we're thinking about the late 80s, and I was thinking about the show that Leslie and I did at MICA called Art is a Verb, mm-hmm. which was really about African-American artists, a new generation that were doing performance and installation work. And they were using newspaper, mm-hmm. they were using mm-hmm. cornmeal, they mm-hmm. were using branches, they were doing. Mm-hmm. So that kind of conceptual work, you know, like was also happening. So I don't know if there's been a history of art, you know, like a history of art in the 80s that sort of really talks about this. Probably the closest is Contextures, which was written by Linda Bryant and right. Marcy Flynn. that sort of really, talks about this whole thing. So this was like really interesting to me because it really began to sort of like put Willie's work into like a very interesting context. So this is, I call moving closer to resolution. He finally starts to sort of do some paper mache in these works, which I think were shown at the gallery, like a couple of years ago. And a lot of times it's just the frame. And it's these ordinary scenes of New York or, New Orleans. By the late 80s, I'm sorry, he starts the sculptor in him starts, bursting out a little. Mm-hmm. And he starts doing these reliefs, including this one called Dreams. Now, take note in both of them, this is painted and this is sort of like modeled. This whole kind of way that he does these accumulative addition of all these little objects that sort of like illuminate who and what the situation is. But this is a characteristic of his work that you find very often. All right, we did that one. So, as I said, the break with Hammond's and the Just Above Midtown Gallery crew came because he was very interested in this whole thing of narrative. And so he has this quote that he wanted to make sure that his mother could understand his art. So you have like these kind of incredible, like works that he's doing in the early 90s. This one, Close Your Eyes and you can see Africa just sort of reaching across. And I was thinking about my friend Judy up in Old Lyme, Connecticut, telling me that the shale on the mountains, cliffs near her house were related to some cliffs in Africa. So that brought us back to the whole thing of the notion of that unified continent, Pangea, before all the different landmass begin to sort of separate. So you sit there, you go like, it just sort of takes you into different ways. But I just love the poetry of, like you can sort of stand there and just reach across the Atlantic and sort of get there. And then An American Family, very poignant commentary on the situation of the family, particularly the situation of the young son. Black kids shoot each other, confusion about a toy. So we begin to sort of see that he's using text as along with his little system of symbols and stuff to sort of really expand the sort of reach of his narrative. This is one of my favorites. I mean, the models are his daughter and who's here. Is this you?
Oh yeah, in yellow.
Okay, good. And two neighbors' friends, and they're sort of writing on the board, and there's like, symbols and signs all over their clothes. So they're talking about South Africa in the other sense, but it's also 1992. So they're also talking about Columbus encounter, like in the Americas. Mm-hmm. And, clearly he's looking at Jacob Lawrence's panel 58 from the Migration series. And mm-hmm. it's really part of his call and response with artists that indicates his lifelong interest in art and art history, but also his way to pay homage to his mentors, people he considers his artistic mentors. So I think one of the extraordinarily prolific groupings within these paper mache works are these twinned figures that both refer to Yoruba celebration of twins and also Congo and Kisi figures. So very often they have these sort of little cavity, like openings. He called the twinning possibility as sort of representing the more spiritual aspect as well as the physical aspect. Mm-hmm. He did this Nairobi series in Kenya, again, alluding to the connections between continents. There is some red earth from Kenya, which is very similar to red earth that you find in South Carolina, so back and forth. More interesting is for Malcolm and Martin, where he's taking two, when I grew up, Malcolm was over here and Martin was over there. And it wasn't until unfortunately, they both, left us, that we began to sort of know more about their lives and realizing how their philosophies had begun to sort of approach each other and sort of like merge. Martin got more radical as he was in Memphis trying to organize labor with the sanitation workers. And Malcolm sort of began to have a much larger sense of his position as a global citizen when he went to Mecca and saw all his fellow Muslims who came in every color and hue and, in that sense. So it's a very powerful piece. But I think the thing that's so amazing is just like this kind of obsessive, like just constant pattern all over, just sort of really moving your eyes and balls, and the additive aspects, sometimes they're bottle tops that sort of really sort of enliven, these figures. I just put this in because Willie and I had a big fight in 1989 when
One of many.
When I published an article on Robert Colescott that was on the cover of Art Forum magazine, and the cover image was George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware, which we all know sold for $15 million. And so when we were doing our interviews for my essay, he said, I really liked Bob Thompson and Robert Colescott because they were really off the charts. I said, really, Willie? Do you remember, all the crap you gave me? So I put this in because like Lotto Dreams is not in the show, but it's a piece that, sort of really expands, like the sort of format for these pieces, of having a head with all these Lotto dreams, like on top of house, a car, nice clothes, sort of going into it, reminding you of Gelede masks that, like such as this one from the Afro-Brazilian Museum. But also it reminded me of Colescott's painting, A Star, A View from the Pinnacle, of this guy having all these dreams, like in back. So I guess we sort of came to a kind of meeting around, around Robert Colescott, through this project. I'm sort of getting now to the point where Willie, we're talking about 94, 95, Willie is ready to go back to New Orleans. And Leslie will take over, on that part. But he still was not quite finished with the paper mache works. This one, OJ, Guilty or Not Guilty, is an amazing one. It has Mark Furman's name on it. It has whiteness on it. It has red, white, and blue. Is an American. Is he guilty? Not guilty? So he's sort of doing a kind of polemic on this, piece of clothing. He also did a piece related to David Driscoll, who actually sent him a shirt. And he made a pattern from the shirt and made a piece that was alluding to an African warrior that was a memorial to David Driscoll. But what was interesting for me was that the relationship to some work that Sam Gilliam had done in the late 60s. He had, Sam, had been, splashing and spritting and, spritzing and on the canvas, taking everything off the stretchers and things. And he did this installation with clothing that he splattered and everything. And it was called Dark Like Me. But then he took the individual components of the clothing and made them into three pieces called Jail Jungle 1, 2, and 3. And this is number 2. And it was hanging here. Why this is so relevant is because when Willie came to Micah, he wanted to study with Sam. But Sam had already left the faculty. So I thought it was a nice kind of, connection. Just showing you another one. This is one of 2 he did, sort of marking sort of elders in the church. He did one for male and one for female, and again reminding you of the relationship to Leslie Dill. And then finally, Spirit House, which although it's 1993, I consider it the denouement of his career in New York. It was first exhibited at the Sculpture Center. It's paper mache built around a living tree. You can sort of see some, and on this image in the right, it's very fuzzy inside, so that people could go and sit and see the tree, and there were like, stars around it. The surface of the house is covered with notations, letters, little objects that he solicited from over 100 different artistic companions around the globe to sort of make it, come together. And you can sort of see some details here. And it's sort of like a real, it was recognized at the time by all the critics that it was like a kind of relationship to praise houses that you can find all over the South. And Leslie kindly found me this slide of the praise house she did with her late great husband, Jose Mapili, for Seneca Village, which was exhibited in 2006 at the New York Historical Society when I co-curated a show on the contemporary artists looking at the legacy of slavery. That's my story, and I'm sticking by it.
The down one.
The down one.
The down.
Okay, fine. Thank you. My relationship or history with Willie Birch predates Lowery's for a lot of reasons. Because when you saw the image of when you saw the image of the crucifix that she did for Saint Xavier, the wooden cross, that particular commission allowed for Willie Birch to then be able to have money to come to MICA to work on his MFA degree. And at that time, I had just begun, I was just appointed to the adjunct faculty to start teaching courses. And the first course I was asked to teach was a course called Africans, I called it Africans in the New World, where I dealt with the presence of African diasporic presence from the southern tip of South America up to the border of Canada. Willie Birch signed into that class. Oh my God. Every time we met, the course was a challenge because as I tried to give forth my wisdom, my interpretation, Willie Birch also had a position that he demanded to have heard by the class. It was not unrealistic that at times I would find the newspaper in the class, ball it up and make balls and just throw it at Willie Birch and say, "Shut up," right? Our relationship was framed by this kind of contest of personalities, which we both appreciated. And I think that he was thoroughly charged by the idea that he could have a conversation or an argument or a position, oppositional or whatever, with somebody who was equally as passionate about this subject as possible. I was an anomaly on the campus because after Sam Gilliam left the faculty, I became the only Black faculty on Maryland Institute's campus. And then within a few years, probably 2 years after Willie had graduated, I then became the dean of the graduate school. And I will talk about that a little bit later on because some of my greatest wonders are sitting right here in the front row. But Willie Birch was seminal in my development as a young scholar, just coming out of Johns Hopkins University with my PhD, because I was fascinated with the diasporic sensibilities about how we as African Americans prevailed in this society. And so my work began to circulate around the ordinariness of Black people who were the extraordinary manifestation of this new world culture. But the intersection that Willie and I found each other dancing around was the ways in which the sacred and the aspects of what I call material culture interfaced with this evolution of an aesthetic, which at the time was not being given any attention at all. It was in, I believe, 1969 at a College Art Association meeting that I first heard a lecture by Robert Ferris Thompson. And it was electrifying. Completely reordered my entire universe. All right? Because in that talk, he talked about African influences on African American art. And he went all the way back to the essential beginning of how space was dealt with, how objects were dealt with, how color was dealt with, how gesture and stance were developed. And that lecture was so impactful, I remember that, and I'm holding on this for a deliberate reason, because after he finished giving the principal lecture that he was asked to give for the conference, people started asking questions. And he said, don't you know about this? And people in the audience were going, no. And don't you know about that? No. And all of a sudden, he looked to the organizers and he said, do we have to leave this room? We were in a big auditorium. I don't know where we were. And they said, no, there's nothing going to be here anymore. He continued to give 2 additional lectures. We were in that space for more than 3 hours. I was done. I was a groupie. I was a devotee. I was completely convinced. Why? One of the reasons is because Willie and I bonded, and I think he accepted this idea that I was grappling with the same issues that he was grappling with, because my family had migrated from Barbados. So I understood the culture of that region of the culture. And because if you understand the history of New Orleans was a composite of indigenous, Spanish, African, and the convergence of all of these cultures coming together. Linguistically, ideologically, religiously, spiritually, and God knows where the gumbo come from. All right? Fast forward, I will tell you about a gumbo competition that Willie and I. Anyway, if we know the history of New Orleans, because no matter wherever Willie went, New Orleans was foundational to his understanding, foundational to everything ideologically that he believed in and that he was trying to elicit in his work. So here, in this work here, these are later works. I'm using later pieces, and I'm drawing also from the essay that I did for his coming retrospective, where Willie was looking at centering New Orleans as the place in the United States where, if you wanted to begin to understand the nature of where this aesthetic sensibility came from. And there's a scholar, Vincent Winbush, that I worked with around 1999, 2000, when he was doing he got a huge grant from the Ford Foundation to study the impact of biblical studies on the African American experience. And in this narrative that he created, he said that what we don't understand about this history is that even though we came in the whole of the ship, in the bottom, and we had endured the Middle Passage and all of the struggles, he said, we didn't forget our history, our legacy, our heritage. He said, it got scrambled. It got scrambled. And in this scrambling, it doesn't leave the DNA because we're hardwired with this. What happens is, as you have moments of, and my grandmother called it pause, reflections float to the surface and it comes out. And so I would see things in Willie's works. And I say, Willie, what's this up? So here over here is a gate. And in New Orleans, we know that iron workers were very important to the rebuilding of that city. And iron workers, you know, in the French Quarter, and you look up at all those buildings, the incredible design, and you can take it all the way back over to South Carolina with Philip Simmons. There is a recapitulation of images that keep coming up, and they have to do with the Sankofa. And these are the Adinkra signs and symbols that come out of the Ghanaian Asante cultures, okay? And so here, this symbol is about a bird who looks back to reclaim. So basically, the Sankofa image means to go back and get it. Go back and reclaim which was once yours. Do you understand? And so by extension, Willie is looking at and trying to create from that platform of drawing from materials, ideas, and energies. Do you understand? That were known to him, comfortable to him, but he didn't understand the impact and the implication and the intentionality of that information. So when we look even at these works across here in this exhibition, he is talking about in very nuanced ways the impact that this has had on his life and on the citizens of the community that he loved. Now, Willie Birch can draw, he can paint, he can sculpt, okay? He's also a fantastic raconteur, all right? He could have been a minister. He could have been a preacher, okay? Willie comes out the house, he'd be talking, hi, how you? How do? That's his word, how do? How do you do, okay? I remember having my essay edited, okay? And they were trying to correct an Anglicize. And I went, no, 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 no. That's not the way they function in New Orleans, okay? You get a little bit, all right? But there is a camaraderie, and it is about the relationship that you have with the other human being. But more importantly, the relationship you have with things, stuff, okay? Now, the stuff is what we call in anthropological, archaeological, scientific arenas, which is called material culture. It's the ordinary stuff. It's the stuff we take for granted, okay? It's the shoes, the clothes, the architecture. It's the objects that we can't function with or without. And if it's missing, we're gonna have a meltdown. I remember having my son one time when he was 5 years old. He didn't have a spoon in the morning for the cereal that he wanted to eat. So he had a meltdown. I'm like, what the freaking hell is this about? So when he came home and and he was in the bathroom, and the relationship I was having at the time, that gentleman went in the bathroom. He said, look, I suggest you get dressed, because if you don't get dressed and you're having this argument about this spoon, you understand, your mother's going to drag you into school in your pajamas. And that could be very embarrassing. So when my son came home that evening, and I said to him, what was this about the spoon? He says, okay, Mom, I was just having a bad day. Okay. However, I didn't let that go, because I said, there are certain objects that have specific meanings to individuals. Okay. So I had to go back into it. So I'm looking at this gate, which is a passageways, because the way architecture is built in New Orleans, you have these shotgun houses, which are long and narrow. And then sometimes where you could afford, a gate would be provided to create sacred space so that you didn't have to go into the intimacy or what I call the interiority of Black space. Okay. And that's where Willie was moving towards. What is the nature of Black space? What is it about the space in between that we don't talk about, but that's there? It's the sacred space, okay? And then God knows that there are objects in that sacred space. So I'm looking at this and I said, okay, I see it. I see all the Adinkra. I see the Sankofa images inside. And then I look down here, remembering, that's the name of the piece, for Joyce Scott. Well, I don't know if you know the artist Joyce J. Scott in Baltimore, bead artist, excellent. By the time Willie got to the Maryland Institute, Joyce Scott had just gotten back from finishing her master's degree at the Institute Allende in Mexico. And so 2 o'clock in the morning, this is when Joyce and I, because she's a night bird and I'm a night bird, I said, Joyce, yo, what's up? What happened? You and Willie have a thing? I said, so I sent her this picture. I said, is this about you? She says, I don't know. I know we dated a little bit or something. Okay, all right. I'll take that. Okay. She said, yeah, we hung out. And when I had talked to Willie about it, Willie, you don't give up nothing. He's not going to admit. All right. So I said, fine. So whatever this gate represents, there is also a symbolic sacred meaning in here. So at some point when I get down there for the opening, I'm gonna beat him up and I'll figure it out.
It's got hearts.
Now, Willie is now at this point by 2000. Let me just say this. 2005, Katrina hits. Okay. Willie is an alum of Maryland Institute College of Art. Willie is having his first retrospective at the New Orleans Museum of Art. Willie calls me up, it was like 2001. Leslie, I'm having a retrospective. I said, finally, your ass is getting some attention in the art world, okay? He says, yeah, but I want you to write an essay for me. I said, Willie, I can't write an essay for you. He said, why not? He said, you've been dealing with me all of these years. And I said, Willie, I can't do that because part of the reality of your culture I have never experienced, okay? I haven't been there. I haven't lived through Mardi Gras. I don't know the Zulus. I need to know the Zulu clans. He said, okay. He said, there is time because of the timeline of the essay for you to get down here. So I went down and for 2 weeks, I went through all of the cycles, of the spaces and the places that he and his best friend, Ram Bachet, who is of the Bachet family of jazz musicians. And we went to all those spaces. And we went to a presentation of the Mardi Gras Indians that was underneath the trestles, the overpass, all right, in the ward aside from where everything was happening. And I was satisfied, all right? In fact, they left me there in the middle of the performance because I went into the circle where the Indians were dancing because one of the Indians was having problems because the feathers had gotten into his face and the regalia that they wear is so massive, he couldn't get it out. So I went in and I just started to pull it out so he could breathe, okay? Willie tells me I swear to God, 6 months ago, said, Leslie, they don't let anybody in the circle. He said, they let you in the circle. I went, whoa, that was, and I'm glad I didn't know. Okay? Because it would have intimidated me for all the wrong reasons, all right? And then when I turned around, Willie and Ron were gone. They left me there all by myself. So much for allegiance. So here, Willie by now is starting to do images of the people, recording them in a standing figure like Robert Farris Thompson had talked about, because standing in West African art is the position of what is called standing alive, purposeful, ready to deal with issues in the community. But the thing that also is fascinating is the way Willie is looking at the textures, the patterns, the shadows, the lines, the hard verticals, the hard horizontals, the trees, the nature, everything that's coming together in this abandoned, locked up house. All right? This is not a lived-in house. This is a house that had a life that is not. Okay, 2005. Katrina hits. I'm calling Lowery. Lowery, have you heard from Willie? No, I haven't heard from Willie. We don't know where Willie is. Finally, I find Willie and he responds. And I said, Willie, what's up? What's going on? He says, Leslie, it's really bad. He says, I have a patron who has agreed to take all the works, because in his house, he owns 2 houses, 2 row houses together. He said, and they're all on paper. Everything in this space, the paper and the paper mache are in this house. Humidity is up here. He says they're going to move all of my work to a warehouse in Texas until it passes. So I go to the president of the school of Micah, and I say to Fred Lazarus, I said, you know, I've been working on an essay for Willie Birch. I have been down there, and his exhibition is supposed to open 2005, all right, at the New Orleans Museum of Art. Cannot open. Fred Lazarus says, he's an alum. He says, tell Willie to come to Baltimore. We will give him the house that we have for artists to live in. We will give him a studio so that he can continue to work, since we now know his work is going to be safely stored in Texas. Willie came back to Baltimore for 6 months, worked our nerves to a frazzle. Drove the faculty crazy. The faculty turned around and said, what are you trying to do to us? Are you trying to make us be more productive like you? Willie's like, just get out of my way. I have work to do. I have places to go, people to meet. All right. He did a series of lithographs. Brilliant. Not just any lithographs, 6-foot diptychs, okay, which are now in the Reginald F. Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History and Culture. Then, for the coup de grace of his residency, he said, I'm going to do a performance. I said, what do you mean, Willie? He says, I want to do a performance. I said, okay. What he wanted to do, because most urban centers are dealing with, and I have to say, even today, the violence is just rampant. It is irrational. It is a sign of the chaos of the contested times that we are living in. He says, I want to do a performance. I said, oh, sort of like Mardi Gras? Fine. We got, and we did the performance. It happened the week after Halloween. So I told all my students, I said, get your Halloween costumes and put them on. Part of your course responsibilities is you're going to be part of this performance. And the students were growling, you know, because my students in the daylight are not good. You know, they're like managing feral cats. That's what teaching art students is like. You never know what they're going to do or when they're going to do it. They have highs and lows, and at any point they break. So we got out there, had to call the police department to remind them that I had a permit for a parade. Okay, I had a high school group come with a marching band. I had hired a group of musicians who could do the New Orleans front music, okay? And it wasn't until the students heard the high school band that they realized this was real. Willie had created a coffin, all right, that was held up, and we went out into the street and we made buttons that we handed out, okay? Stop the apathy, stop the apathy, stop the apathy. Went around, and it was fabulous. His last gesture was that he was in the school while he's remembering and teaching everyone about New Orleans. His last gesture was one day in the elevator. The director of the galleries at the Maryland Institute was from Louisiana. And he and Willie were, you know, talking smack about who cooked the best gumbo. And I looked at this and I said, oh, I said, what? You all gonna have a gumbo cook-off? And they said, oh yeah, let's do that. And I said, well, you're not gonna have a good gumbo cook-off without a woman in the mix, okay? I said, so I'm throwing my gumbo in the pot. We had a 3-way gumbo cook-off. We had 350 students show up. We had the house caterers on campus cook the rice. I had a cauldron. Willie had a little modest pot, and the other guy had another modest pot. My son and my nephew came in the house because they knew I was doing this gumbo cook-off, and I had big pots like this that I did. And I said, okay, keep stirring it while I get dressed. I said, put it in the car. We taped it up, got it there. Long story short, I won the gumbo cook-off. Whoa. Willie will not ever let me forget that. So here is Willie's studio. Again, recapitulation. See the grate on the wood on the door with the Sankofa symbols, and there's Willie behind there, okay, with a mask on, because of course, you know, by the time he got back to New Orleans, it was just horrific what had happened and all of the difficulties in breathing the environment. When I went back to New Orleans in the following year, you could see water lines on the walls of the buildings as it went along. But what I wanted to really show you is here, even in the public gardens, okay, you had these beautiful, beautiful works. But then also you have this crucifix, okay? And it's not necessarily Christian, even though New Orleans is a Catholic city, all right? And the day after Mardi Gras is, of course, Ash Wednesday. And everybody's walking around with the ashes on their foreheads. So everybody is committed. But it's not only that, because if you know your geometry from Africa, the diamond, the square, and the circle, okay, with the intersection is the sign of the Congo cross, all right? And this is how they have internalized and started to bring back over the history of New Orleans development from the 18th century forward. And so Willie is constantly doing that. And this slide over here is Willie's yard, because Willie is not only drawing, like you see here, this is what his studio looks like. Willie is also outside taking the natural environment, taking the natural elements and fashioning them and putting them on the fences. So these were crosses that were then, which he allows to fall back into nature and fall back apart. But then Willie also creates his sculptures, all right? And the bottle tree, this is where I'm going to just take my lecture for here, because there's so much that he has been doing, but I wanted to show you the evolution, the cycle of this. This is a piece that he put together. It's called Falling Flowers. And on it, it says imagine. But this is a bottle tree sculpture of all of the bottles that he has collected, that his neighbors have collected, that he has put together. And the history of the bottle tree phenomenon came from, believe it or not, all the way back, and it's been traced back to even before the 9th century in Africa, in the Congo region, where the bottle was used to kind of like capture evil spirits or negative spirits or demonic spirits. Do you understand? So that they did not go back into society or into family environments and reclaim another living person back into the land of the deceased. All right. So here, Willie Birch recapitulates or reconvenes this kind of identity. This is a wonderful photograph by my partner, Lowery Sims, because we went down, was it year before last, to remember when we went to New Orleans?
It was last year.
It was last year. Last year we went down. So my son, I gave him a camera when he was 5 years old to see what the technology was going to be at the time. So now, as I'm an adult, he is stalking me, making a documentary. And he wanted to interview Willie Birch. So we got to, while we were working on the essay, we said, oh, it's a twofer. Let's go. My son and his partner got a big grant. So we all went down and we got to see this. One of the many pieces that Willie had done in his yard, in his community. And here's what happens. Because Willie also uses photography, all right? Willie walks through his community. He documents individuals, he documents locations, he documents the Mardi Gras Indians, the Zulus, the people walking, going to church, especially the second line, everything that is germane to the distinctiveness of what New Orleans culture is about. And so here he reimagines this piece, Falling Flowers, 2025. This is where he is right now in terms of the scale and the dynamics of his work. But should you doubt where this work comes from, this is 1941. Eudora Weltley, all right? When she was doing work for the WPA and going through, and this is Mississippi, here you see these bottle trees. People would put them on the outside of the house, the perimeter of the house, in order to protect the house and the individuals living in the house. Here are details. Not only do you have bottles, all right, but you also had pots, all right? You had vessels at the top. You also had round structures, might have been wheels, old wheels. Remember, the circle is, remember there's a biblical, I'm not a good Christian at all, even though I was raised in the church, okay? But Ezekiel had the wheel, all right? This is, again, a replay on all of those images. Over here, this same house, okay? You see these trees, bottles. Blue was the preferred color. Blue was the preferred color. When I was in Savannah, blue is also used around the trim of windows and doors. It's called haint blue to prevent the evil negative spirits from coming in. I remember I was in a house, structure very much like this, and I looked up and I said, what is that blue? The whole ceiling was painted blue. And we were on a tour, and the guide said, oh, this was a house where when the master saw the blue and the slaves who lived in the top level, he would not go past the blue because he was afraid something might happen to him, because that was not a space that was conducive to him being present. Going back to 1830, so you know, this is an ethnographer. Many, many anthropologists and scientists or pseudoscientists who went into the early areas of Africa would do sketches of what they saw. And this is the grave of a Congo king, all right? And around the perimeter of the grave are vessels or containers which were dug and placed halfway into the ground so that it was believed that the spirits would go in, just like flies, you know, flies being nosy and they get in the bottle and then they can't figure out how to get out. The same kind of concept, all right? So here you see these images. Now, one day, in the middle of doing all this research, Lowery and I were working on Willie Birch writing, and we very often share our research back and forth. She reads mine, I read hers. We give each other critiques before the editors give us critiques so that we know if we're on the right track, so that when the editor comes back with feedback, we can counterbalance it to make sure that, you know, because there's a lot of code switching that goes on in the writing. So we have to remember which audiences we're trying to appeal to. All right. So anyway, I'm in the car with Joyce Scott, lived around the corner from her. She's the godmother. This is the godmother one of the North, and Joyce is the godmother of the South of my son. And Joyce and I, all of a sudden, we stopped in the middle of Baltimore. In the middle of Baltimore. And here is this bottle tree. Why is it here? Because along the back row there is a funeral home. And you see the beginning of a second bottle installation that is growing. All right? We were absolutely knocked out. Knocked out. Unfortunately, I had not sent in my essay yet. And I said, okay, this is going to be in the book to let you know that this attitude prevails. Reading around 9/11, when Arthur Danto was asked to do an exhibition at the Apex Gallery, all right? He was recalling the moment after the planes hit the towers of the World Trade Center that he got a call from the Nation magazine, and the editor said, have you seen any impact of 9/11 in the art world? And he thought that it was like, I hadn't thought about that. And he said he started to go out on the street and walk around. He said, and all of a sudden he realized the anonymity of unknown shrine makers had responded, all right? Because this phenomenon is not just only centered in Africa. This is a kind of human global response to trauma. So with that, Willie Birch would love this last slide. Everything that's thrown away, you find another way. Hey, you can tell him, I remembered. Willie was always one. Find a way, make a way. Waste not, want not. I'm a child. Lowery's a child. Many of you are children raised by depression culture parents. Okay? All right? This coming of this horrific administration we have right now, many of us are like, yeah, we know this. Find a way to make a way. All right? We're going to get there anyway. All right? We know this stuff. We have survived. We have prevailed. So with this work that I've been doing and the work that I did with Lowery Sims when we did Art as a Verb, which was absolutely seminal, I got to run a project with Micah because the president at the time thought that because I was a Black female dean that all these Black students and Latino students would run to Micah to be, educated with an MFA degree. And I went, you're missing the point. You're so obsessed with the Black and the white and the red and the brown and the yellow. Okay, you're forgetting that the real issue is green. Okay? If there is nobody is coming. All right? So he said, well, if I get the money, do you think you can get some students to apply? I said, tell me when you have the money. I know. Literally, just like that. And here we have Candida Alvarez and Daoud Bey, two of my most brilliant. No. And so with the beginnings of Willie Birch from my first experience to this experience to now, and you all better go see that John Wilson show at the Met, all right? Witnessing Humanity. I have been blessed with just an incredible career with amazing human beings who are the most extraordinary, gifted artists that America has. And I thank you all for coming.